So Dick wanted to create a place where not just people who had been damaged by psychiatry, but who were going through what Christina Groth later called spiritual emergencies could come. Context of opening and acceptance and exploration rather than putting everything back in the box when people reported experiences that didn't fit the cultural norm.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today my guest is Keith Thompson, author, independent journalist, talk radio host, and former U.S. Senate staff member. Keith's work has appeared in the New York Times, Esquire magazine, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the Sun magazine, coming out of Carborough, North Carolina. He's the author of the new book, The UFO Paradox, and together we talked about how Keith discovered Esalen in 1975 through an article in The New Yorker, his friendship with Esalen co-founder Michael Murphy, how he became involved in the earliest incarnations of Esalen's Center for Theory and Research, the genius of Esalen's No One Captures the Flag approach, the Tuesday morning phenomenon, and the links between the paranormal and the aims of the human potential movement. I think you'll enjoy this conversation with Keith Thompson. Keith Thompson, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. It's great to be here. Let's talk about Esalen.
You have written 2 books about UFO phenomenon as a challenge of sorts to prevailing paradigms. And in both of those books, you acknowledge the Esalen influence on your work and your study of the UFO mystery. There's a couple of pieces of Esalen theory that I could see, or principles of Esalen theory that I could see influencing and shaping your take on UFOs. And those are the Esalen emphasis on experiential learning. And then also, of course, Michael Murphy's exploration of exceptional human capacities. So what do you think about that?
Both of those are great entry points. In 1975, the New Yorker magazine did a profile of a man named Michael Murphy. And it was the most sympathetic report, not a puff piece, not PR flackery, but a thoughtful piece. And I emphasize the fact that it wasn't either a puff piece or a smear piece. Could very easily have been a smear piece. The New Yorker could have had its jollies by making fun of the Californians with their latest.
If it's a 1975 piece, then that's a couple of years after Tom Wolfe published his long essay, The Me Decade.
Oh, he loved to take exception and mock the extreme self-interest. So I come across this New Yorker magazine article, 1975, describing a man, Michael Murphy, and Dick Price, who, you know the story of how they founded the place as a space that would be open to the mysteries, just as religious traditions were, but without the dogma.
Yeah.
Open to the further reaches of the nature of reality that science is supposed to be interested in, but seldom goes that far. There's dogma on both sides. They wanted an exploratory context that didn't exist. And I said, you mean there's a place that is committed to giving people everything, what's in the Esalen catalog now, what was in the catalog then, people like Fritz Perls and Carl Rogers, the founders of these new approaches, new ancient approaches to the human nature. So I said, my only question is, how soon can I get there? How soon can I be a part of this? And I made a life choice. I changed what I was doing in my life at the time. I was heading down the path. I was working at a very young age, working for a U.S. senator. I was convinced at the time that I was interested in social change.
Yeah.
And I had, without quite knowing it, a sense that it was a social change that affirmed human nature in its fullest range. And I'd had a little help in this regard, not only that early life experience, but somehow we all get that book. And my book was Alan Watts' book called The Taboo on Knowing Who You Are. I believe that's the subtitle. The book called The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. Made the claim, made a case for the fact that the idea of the separate individual is pretty much a inculcated hallucination. Well, that was what I experienced that day at age 14. So I'd begun to explore spiritual things. Meanwhile, I was going to be involved in politics. Finally occurred to me that reading this New Yorker profile about a human potential movement, that is what got me to see that by the time I want to be part of something that it involves the development of these ideas before it trickles down into the political realm. Because the political realm in the 1970s, even the political realm today, I think you could agree, is not widely open to the further reaches of human nature. I came to California. I came to Esalen. How do you get to Esalen? You, like everybody else, you're at the top of the road on Highway 1, and you come down that long, steep driveway. The old saying, everybody puts on their pants one leg at a time. Everyone gets to Esalen, going down that road, unless they sneak in the back road. Harder to do these days, or come in through the big Sur Los Padres wilderness, which I don't recommend anybody try. In any case, first met George Leonard. He put me in touch with his friend Mike Murphy. I said, could you introduce me? The New Yorker profile mentioned that Mike was at that time was notoriously reclusive. He'd settled on Telegraph Hill, writing a follow-up to Golf in the Kingdom. And one day I got a phone call. Said, Keith Thompson, Mike Murphy.
Keith, how did you meet George Leonard in the first place? Was it coincidence or?
Well, I came to Esalen and I took workshops, and one of the first ones was with George. I believe it was called Energy and the Energy Body.
He was an Aikido guy. Was this an Aikido class?
It was based on his training in Aikido and his work on his insights into the energy body. He had experiential exercises, including a samurai war on the last day of the 5-day workshop. Very traumatic. He put you in the samurai mindset as an experiment in shifting your identity. Very profound experiment. So afterwards, I think near the end of the workshop, I said to him, George, this has been a great experience. He was tall and robust. He said, well, it's been great having you. Nice meeting you. You made a contribution to the workshop. Let's stay in touch. I said, I'd love to. And he said, by the way, I'd love to meet your friend, Mike Murphy. And he looked at me, and I could still see it. He said, I think Mike Murphy should know who you are too. It was just very warm. He was very a twinkle in his eye. He said, he'll call you. Give me your phone number. And he did. And I was a runner at the time. Mike was a runner. Mike was a serious runner. He eventually trained for the Masters 1500 meter. I don't know. He went to Houston, but it was part of his practice, part of his transformative approach, meditate bodily. So we went on a run on our first day. We developed a fast friendship. I very much identified with his upbringing, as was described in the book. It was similar to mine. He had intuitions of a larger world.
When you were running with him, was jogging a fad at the time? I was looking in the old Esalen workshops, and there's a 1980 workshop that says like beyond jogging.
Word jogging is interesting. I remember around that time in the 70s, Newsweek or Time had a cover story called The Jogging Revolution. Jogging is in. And that's when people were buying special shoes, and running shoe store opened and running clothes open, and people were starting to train for marathons. I got into it for recreational running. It was a great way of just opening up. I believe it was some of my most spacious experiences, biggest experiences in life come from going on a long run. I think Mike opened up to it that way as well. I don't know what really drew him into running. I know he had a coach named Mike Spino who had written.
That's who was offering this workshop.
Okay, well then, sort of the inner game of running, running as a path of inner tennis, the inner game of tennis. There was a period of time in the 60s and 70s, largely motivated by Esalen. So the East was coming to the West. That was the big story at the time, the convergence of these two great religious, spiritual traditions, and holistic health was coming online, complementary medicine. The sense that really anything was possible. I met Mike at the time when, William Blake wrote a book called Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. Mike referred to that when Mike and I had lots of conversations early on. There were 20 years of difference between us. He became kind of a mentor figure for me, but that was never anything. He was not my mentor. I think I tried for a while to make him my mentor because I was so happy to have a wise person in my life, but he didn't in any way encourage those projections. It was more two people on the same path. In any case, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. He had come to see that Esalen had come through a big idealistic period. Songs of Innocence, anything possible.
The Songs of Innocence might be the first decade of its existence, and then come into the 70s, it's slightly different because you realize what didn't happen.
What didn't happen, and that there were a lot of casualties. People came to conclusions, if an LSD trip opens you up, maybe I should take LSD every day. There's a big logical jump that did not turn out to be very successful for most people who took that on. So Mike had already come up with the idea. We called it the Tuesday morning phenomenon. I don't know how widely this is mentioned around Esalen, but if you'd come and do a weekend workshop at Esalen, you'd have a peak experience Saturday afternoon, maybe Sunday morning. You were really set to change your life. And then you go back home, go back into the existing structures, the existing relationship with the spouse who didn't go, or the girlfriend or boyfriend who didn't go. The boss is the same. And by Tuesday morning, it would all go away.
Yeah, man, I've never heard that before. That's great.
So Mike got that feedback. More and more people, how do you hold this? Well, one solution was maybe do LSD all the time. No, that isn't actually. How do you develop long-term integral?
Mm-hmm.
What's the role of practice?
Yeah.
So there was a sense there had been a lot of casualties. There had been suicides. There was a long-term Esalen exploration program where, if a little bit of encounter is good, then a lot of encounter must be great. People were breaking each other down in the name of growth, being angry and aggressive. And Fritz Perls played his role in that, clinical genius, but also something of a madman. And one more thing I want to say about Esalen as a context setter, then the genius even now that I see of Esalen was that Mike and Dick, with their different temperaments and their differences, they're two separate individuals, they had a common commitment to a no capture the flag idea, that Esalen would be a forum for many ideas, but it would not be captured by any single idea. And there were efforts to do so. Fritz Perls was very popular at one point with Gestalt awareness practice or Gestalt therapy. And he and his followers, his disciples, made their best case to turn Esalen into the Gestalt center of the world. Will Schutz probably wanted it to be the encounter center of the world. Ida Rolf wanted it to be all Rolfing. I don't want to put these people all in little categories. But Mike and Dick said there will be no capture of the flag. Nothing will be allowed to win, because they had both seen in early groups, sort of spiritual groups they were around. And Mike had been to the Aurobindo ashram in India, his teacher, Sri Aurobindo, and he saw the cultic impulse to reify the teachings of Sri Aurobindo, rather than to see them as an exploratory map of the human potential, the tendency to turn him into the enlightened leader and we must follow. Mike said no. Dick said no. Dick had been institutionalized by his family because he was having, I think, ecstatic experiences. He was having experiences that seemed schizophrenic. So the genius of the place, and by genius, I mean the spirit or daimon of Esalen, was the two founders wanted it to be an open forum. So the list of people they brought in, I wrote their names down from different fields: Arnold Toynbee, the historian; Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist; Alan Watts; Ida Rolf. We could go down. The word was out. Esalen is a place. Joan Baez, the singer, was there in the early days. In the early founding days, there are great stories to be told about how they created the center out of the family property. So the word was out. Esalen was a place to explore. And Mike invited me to help with the early paradigm of what became the Center for Theory and Research. Mid-'80s, Mike had come to feel that the public workshops were doing very well, and they were doing well by practice. Yeah, Esalen had gone from its early format. Esalen was largely lectures. Alan Watts would come in and talk. Teachers would come in and talk. This academic model was still prevalent. And gradually, there was something in the air. It was the 60s, right? LSD, psychedelics, feminism was in the air, civil rights, anti-war. The 60s generation was unfurling like a banner. So people wanted experience. Yeah. It's okay for Alan Watts to talk about these things like meditation, but what about practicing? Carlos Castaneda, a young anthropology student, was hanging around even in the early days for all the suggestions that he must have made up much of those stories about Don Juan, his teacher. Mike has pointed out to me several times that Carlos, as a young graduate student, even before the books were written, was talking about Don Juan Matus and talking about his sorcery apprenticeship with his great teacher. So everything was in the air. People wanted experience. So at that point, by the time I showed up, by the time I was there to do workshops myself and got to know Mike, Mike had a feeling that it was time to have another format. And it was determined that the idea was, let's use the big house, as the Murphy House was then called, the big house across the other side of the property, north side of the property. Let's invite scholars, artists, academics in various fields to come to Esalen, groups of 5 to 10, to talk for 5 days about what's going on in their fields, without having to be on record, without having the pressure to produce anything. Like if you're going to talk for a week, no, you didn't have to tape record it and turn it into a book to publish it. In fact, the idea was if more and more people who work in academia and other fields could talk off the record about the things they really cared about, there might be more room to bring this back into the academy. So with that in mind, we began to brainstorm, and not just Mike and myself, but George Leonard was part of this. This is before Jeff Kripal, the religious scholar of Rice University, who's had such a big impact in recent years, had shown up on the scene and had started writing his books. So there were these programs, the invited conferences were developed, and I played the role. I was a young dude, so I was the logistics guy for the invited conference. I made sure everybody had tools and got to their rooms, and I was generally invited to sit in on the conferences. So yeah, the invited conferences were meant, and they were eventually then, after they got rolling, they were organized under the rubric of a Center for Theory and Research.
What were some of the early CTR conferences that were convened?
Well, pre-CTR. Well, there was one on shamanism. It became a regular cross-cultural shaman. Michael Harner played a major role here. Harner brought in leading anthropologists and shamanic practitioners from Siberia, I mean, from really far out, to really bring them in. What is shamanism? What is it not? And it is our oldest religious tradition, oldest primordial. It's a primordial tradition for exploring further reaches of experience and consciousness. So that went on several years in a row. Ralph Metzner was not part of that one, but Terence McKenna. Well, so then there were conferences on psychedelics, part of the early revisioning psychedelics, and trying to, what we were faced with in the culture was LSD and psychedelics came online so fast. The culture completely overreacted. I believe in less than a week, in 1966, I believe the year was, the United States Congress, people who say Congress can't get anything done, they passed draconian legislation to forbid every kind of psychedelic, including marijuana, as Schedule I drug. They got it done, and they got it signed. So we had a complete overreaction to the dangers of LSD and psychedelics. So there was now the beginning of a thaw. Did we maybe overreact? Yeah, we really overreacted on that. Doesn't mean Tim Leary was right that we should put LSD in the water plant, in the drinking water. This is craziness. There was so much craziness around psychedelics, but it was time to begin to rethink the possible therapeutic uses, more than possible. Clearly advantages of psilocybin and so forth. So I was on board for that. And then there was also one rather less sexy, new approaches to governance. The recognition that as the planet was increasingly one unit, how would our nation state, how would we govern the increasing complexity? So a social scientist, social theorist named Donald Michael, who became a good friend, I think he probably had the longest running invited conference. He wrote a book called On Learning to Plan and Planning to Learn, and how we needed to get better at planning the future, but without trying to make the future a certain way, planning for emergent forces in society. It was a really challenging enterprise. So those are some of the early groups that met, and that part of the excitement of these groups, Sam, was that they met every year. And in the meantime, group members would stay in touch outside of Esalen, but they would come to the property and have really fruitful conversations, similar to the conversations that were had on the property in 1962 to 1966, when the original people like Pearls and Maslow, Alan Watts showed up. So I sort of got to be part of beginning of the second round of Esalen's contribution to the world. One more point, there was always, contrary to what the critics and the society at large talking about too much of the me generation and too much narcissism, Esalen was always conceived as if these human capacities come online, there are implications for society. Mike and Dick Price wanted Esalen to be a place where people who were having experiences in which they would be locked up in psychiatric institutions could come and unfurl, allow the disorder to emerge into an identity that reflected values maybe the culture at large didn't have. I mean, when Dick was young, he had schizophrenic breaks. His father put him in an institute called the Institute for the Living. The Institute for the Living. I say that you have to understand what a euphemism that was. It was a tyrannical institution that kept patients on Thorazine and other repressive psychiatric strategies. So the Institute for the Living. Well, Esalen was an institute for the living in the truest sense. And so Dick wanted to create a place where not just people who had been damaged by psychiatry, but who were going through what Christina Groth later called spiritual emergencies could come and have a context of opening and acceptance and exploration rather than putting everything back in the box when people reported experiences that didn't fit the cultural norm. So there was always a sense of transformation needed to include the institutions of our culture. The idea was not just to set up a place where a private place where people could come and have interesting private experiences. It was the understanding that what was being questioned was the very boundary between public and private. What does it mean to be a human being?
I also think about some of the geopolitical citizen diplomacy that was happening here during the 1980s, and I'm just curious if you had contact with some of the Track 2 work that was happening between the United States and Russia.
I did. I don't have I didn't have a deep involvement in that, but I knew Michael and Dulcie Murphy very closely during those years. And again, they followed the zeitgeist of the time. Michael had heard from Russians who were aware of a life beyond the Soviet Union. There's a deep mystical tradition in Russia, underground, paranormal, psychic. And interestingly, one of the interesting intersections that I was able to have was with Harvard psychiatrist John Mack, who was very involved in political psychology and especially physicians for social responsibility, very oriented toward averting nuclear catastrophe. So John started to come to us. He came to a conference called Frontiers of Healing. And it was at that conference that he and several other mainstream psychiatric and political people were introduced by Stan and Christina Groth to holotropic breathwork. That is a perfect example of an intersection between worlds. Yes. John Mack did not come to Esalen with an orientation to humanistic or transpersonal psychology. He was a psychiatrist trained in the Freudian tradition, which had a very limited sense of the model of the mind and the unconscious. So, but he was an explorer. He was a seeker. He had wonder and astonishment. He'd written a first-class prize-winning novel, autobiography of Lawrence of Arabia. So he came, and as part of a otherwise rational discussion of political psychology at the Big House, the idea was, why don't we have all these participants do some experiential work and see what they can come up with to foster their world? Well, so John Mack was part of the group that did that. He had some very sudden and steep openings. He found he found Jung suddenly. He found the larger unconscious that Carl Jung talked about, that he had no training in. He thought that Carl Jung was kind of sort of an eccentric figure in psychology that had split from Freud. That's still the mainstream definition. Carl Jung was an eccentric religious figure, psychologist who split from Freud. Well, as time has gone on, we see that most of Freud's most of his case studies were invented, and Carl Jung looks better every day in terms of his mapping of a larger unconscious. So as it pertains to John Mack, he happened to become interested around that time in reports of people who were having encounters with alleged aliens. And I had written an article drawing parallels between the alien abduction experience and other kinds of UFO experiences and rites of passage. I was arguing that what's ever going on in the abductions, they appear to be kind of a rite of passage. They appear to be initiation. So John Mack read that article and he said, that's fascinating. He thinks they're all about initiation, but he set aside the question of what they are. So he got in touch with me and said, "What's going on with these?" He said, "Well, that's the question, John." So we got to talk a lot. And John famously and infamously got involved in taking the UFO phenomenon seriously, got in a lot of trouble at Harvard at the time. But again, Esalen was a place where all of these currents could happen. And so, as for Esalen and Track 2, citizen diplomacy, I still tell Mike and Dulcie, where is the book? Why has not an author yet written a book about the role of citizen diplomacy and Esalen's involvement in citizen diplomacy in helping to arrange for a soft landing for the Soviet Union? Because it really had an impact. Boris Yeltsin, the president after Gorbachev, came to the United States, went to a grocery store. He was brought in by Esalen. He went to a grocery store that was stocked with fruits, vegetables, meats, cheese, bread for ordinary people. And he was filled with a combination of sorrow and rage. He said, "My country is based on a lie. Communism is false. It's an oppressive system. It must come down." Well, if it hadn't come down softly, it would have had a hard landing. Esalen's role in the citizen to citizen exchanges, Soviet citizens and American citizens, helped create an infrastructure that made it possible for the Soviet Union to land. Sadly, it was taken over by Vladimir Putin. The empire continues to live, but even that's not the final phase. Mike's book, Golf in the Kingdom, which, as you know, is a novel, so well done. It's a description. So it's like a magic realism novel.
Yes.
It is written by a guy, the author and the protagonist seem to be the same guy, Michael Murphy. And this Michael Murphy talks about going to Scotland and meeting a golf pro named Chivas Irons, with whom he played a legendary round of golf. And Mike didn't present it as a truthful encounter, but it was so well presented as a roman à clé and a true story presented with fictional details that he began to get letters and even phone calls from readers, or he would meet readers when he would go out to talk about the book. He said, "Mr. Murphy, is your friend Chivas Irons? Does he ever come to the United States?" And Mike would say, "Well, you've got to be kidding. This is a fictional character." No. You dressed him up as fictional. Certainly Chivas Irons is real. The reason they said this is that people began to contact Mike and say, and it was very private. He said, "When I play golf, or when I'm out for a run, or when I'm engaged in some kind of sport, I have had experiences of being teleported. I've had experiences of being beyond my body. I've had experiences of abnormal strength. I hear music that I can't explain the source of. I feel secret symmetries that I can't explain." So Mike began to realize, well, this put Mike on the path to research into sport as one arena that gives testimony to a larger human nature. And this led to Michael Murphy's book, The Future of the Body, which in turn influenced my book, because I think because my view is the UFO phenomenon is to a large extent about untapped human capacities. The abduction, these alleged alien abductions, I say alleged because they're alleged to be people taken by aliens. There are elements of these that are consistent with experiences that religious contemplatives have, including levitation, bilocation, paranormal experience. The UFO lore is filled with paranormal evidence. And so I see the UFO phenomenon, for better or worse, provisionally as far more about the paranormal than about the extraterrestrial. There is still no recovered craft. I know there are rumors of recovered craft and aliens, but in the meantime, it never shows up. But what we do have are extraordinary experiences of people who interact with beings from other realms, which is very much also part of shamanic evidence and psychedelic evidence.
How do you connect the paranormal to untapped human potential? How are those related?
Just first of all, there's now extensive laboratory evidence led by a couple of good researchers, including Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, RADIN. At the Institute of Noetic Sciences lab, the IONS lab in Northern California, they've done very good laboratory, empirical, experimental evidence, pretty much knocking the socks off the old argument that there's no evidence for paranormal stuff. So in other words, the argument is that paranormal capacities, telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition, are deeply embedded in humans at large, but are not widely recognized. So the idea that there's no communication beyond across the line between mind and matter is about a 300-year-old idea that is simply a doctrine of materialism. It's not a scientific fact. So there are numerous other examples of people often have rushes of energy in their bodies that are sometimes related to spiritual practice, but not always spontaneous. That is called Kundalini.
Mm-hmm.
People have a big part of the spiritual emergency network that Stan and Christina, Spiritual Emergence Network, I think they ended up calling it, that Stan and Christina Groff founded at Esalen, was to give people a framework for unsolicited experiences of a larger human nature that often occur, but in ways that are upsetting and disturbing and related to breakdown. I mean, if you're having the kind of experience I had at 14, which came to me in a very positive way, but the breakdown of the line between the personal and transpersonal self can be profoundly unsettling if it comes in a context that is not welcome. And I think that the encounters with the UFO phenomenon are are something very much like that. We're encountering a larger reality. Places like Esalen that have placed an emphasis on practice and exploration of consciousness, including psychedelics, and not just at Esalen, but throughout the world. It seems to me quite possible that as human beings have begun to explore consciousness for the past 50 years with a greater degree of intensity and focus, that we're starting to discover aspects of reality that have always been here, but have been outside the framework. So that's what the UFO essentially is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I have a question. I'm not sure I can phrase it in the best possible way. Maybe I'll give it a shot. So back in the 60s, 70s, when a lot of people are drawn to Esalen to engage in things like Gestalt therapy with Fritz Perls or the encounter group work with Will Schutz, this work is really predicated around, as you put it earlier, this sort of unfolding, unfurling of the self. But that self, I think, is bracketed in a certain sense. It's thought of as sort of a stable, idealized core thing that can be released. And that was what the project of the 60s too, like fighting back against the repressive bonds of the earlier decade of the 50s, which was so much about conformity and repression. And it's about whether you're going to do encounter groups or Gestalt or psychedelics. It's about like releasing this thing. But the paradigm that you're kind of speaking about has to do with breaking down the boundaries between the self and the personal self and the transpersonal self. How do these ideas interact? How does the exploration of transpersonal self expand upon that project?
I don't know if I'm advocating or describing a breakdown between the personal and transpersonal, but we find that the line is far more porous.
Okay.
One thing Mike shared with me when I first got to know him was the ease with which people find themselves slipping into larger states, how the equilibrium, the social equilibrium that says you're a separate self and separate, independent, long-lasting self, for which there's evidence. You've got a birth certificate, you've got a driver's license, you can prove you're an individual. The IRS knows you're an individual, and they will come after you if you pretend not to be who you say you are. So, but from an ontological standpoint, the question of who are we was wide open in the early days of it. It was the Wild West at Esalen.
Yeah.
The ease with which people were opening into larger spaces that were it's what Freud called the return of the repressed.
Yeah.
For him, it consisted of largely when Victorians would have sexual dreams. Well, of course, that's what Victorians would have. They had repressed sexuality, so their return of the repressed was violence and sex. Freud over-extrapolated and said, oh, that's all there is to the unconscious. Sex and drugs, sex and violence, and so forth. And Jung came along and said, no. The unconscious is the collective unconscious as well as a personal unconscious. So Esalen essentially decided to open, and I shouldn't say just decided, Esalen opened trapdoors into the collective unconscious so that people were opening to vast experiences that questioned their identity. You mentioned Will Schutz or Bill Schutz. He often was called Bill. I got to know him. I took some of his encounter groups at Esalen. And one day I was sitting in the lodge and he came in. He said, "Why don't you look pensive? What's on your mind today, Mr. Thompson?" So he sat down and got a coffee. I said, "I don't know. I'm just sitting here thinking today. Here's what's on my mind, Bill. This was at a time when a few of the mainstream, the leading gurus, like Chogyam Trungpa of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. On the one hand, he wrote incredible books about the nature of consciousness and the flowering of the deepest dharmic Buddha mind. At the same time, in his personal life, he was a nightmare, unresolved psychological issues. Then take Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. You read his books, they are brilliant chronicles of the larger transpersonal self. But in the meantime, he had so much unfinished business in the rest of his life. So I put this out. I said, "Bill, this is what I'm thinking about. What is it that accounts? How can these people be so realized and so screwed up at the same time?" Well, he said to me, he leaned forward. He said, "Here's what I'll tell you. Beware the chakra skippers. Beware the chakra skippers." Now, I knew what the chakras were, the 7 energy centers in the body. And I knew the idea was that each one had to do with a certain sense of identity. Solar plexus is power. The heart chakra is love. The third eye and so I had kind of concluded that if somebody had deep wisdom of a transpersonal type, like Chogyam Trungpa or Rajneesh, and there were others, famous legendary gurus who ran amok, that must have meant they had resolved their issues at every other level of their being. And his argument was, you can have 6th or 7th chakra insight and be really screwed up around sex and power. Beware the chakra skip. So he was giving voice to something that Mike Murphy developed around integral development. That we have different centers of our being, different aspects of our being in which we may have more purchase. We may have greater integration, but we may have other areas that are completely out of our conscious field. So don't skip your chakras. Make sure you do all your work. And yet at the same time, don't take an authoritarian approach that you could imply that, to take an integral approach means you'll get it all together someday, and then you won't have any more issues. That's not the idea, but it's to understand that there are many virtues, and there's what Mike wrote about in the book, The Future of the Bodies, was that we need a mutual entailment of the virtues. For example, that's a fancy for the mutual entailment of virtues. Mike and George Leonard and others in the area in the early days of the human potential movement began to realize that, for example, Fritz Perls placed great emphasis on candor, radical honesty. But there was a growing recognition that honesty without compassion can be a monstrous thing. So radical honesty, there was a lot of cruelty that was celebrated as radical honesty.
Yeah.
And the same with the encounter movement, push people to confess to their places that they're not telling the truth. Breaking people down, it can be profoundly destructive. People jumped off the cliff at Esalen.
When you were engaged in the encounter group work, did you find any of it excessively confrontational?
Oh, I think my ego did at times, my sense of Keith. But no, at that point, it seemed a lot cleaner. There was a lot more understanding. Schutz was very interested in his encounter movement, began to be informed by sensory awareness, by meditative approaches. He in his early days would, if a woman had or a man had qualms about their body representation, their body identity, why he would strongly recommend they take off their clothes in front of the group. Well, probably see there might be some problems with that approach, in the sense that it can be a shaming. And so when two people, he also described in his early days, he would see two people who had energy, some kind of unresolved energy in the group. He'd pick them out and say, "You two get up here, work this out right now." Sometimes it'd end up almost in fistfights. So that stuff was over by the time. That kind of Wild West acting out. There was a lot of acting out at Esalen, but that was, you could say that's because the culture had settled on such a narrow band of possibilities.
Yeah.
The churches, mainstream Protestant churches and Catholic Church, were not places where this kind of exploration was happening. It is far more the case now. The churches, more people identify themselves than ever before as spiritual but not religious. And the religions are starting to figure out there is, every field has been affected by the kind of work Esalen has done.
When you think about the greatest takeaway for you for your involvement with the Esalen Institute, what comes to mind, Keith Thompson?
I would say that the making room for multiple perspectives has been crucial for me. The idea that Mike and Dick founded a place that no single approach would win out, but that you could explore deeply, that there was more to explore, there was more to understand, there was more to live in what it means to be a human being. And the emphasis on dialogue and interaction and relation, but the emphasis on experience. I have yet to find any aspect of life that isn't experiential. At the time, I thought that transformation for the culture was imminent. I now realize, if you ask what I've learned about all of this, it is very possible and very easy to misread your own transformative impulse. Transformation can be very much alive in your own life. And you can imagine that it's about to come in the culture at large. I mean, George Leonard wrote a book in the 70s called The Transformation. And it was a description, a mapping of a kind of impending transformation. And it was a kind of almost millenarian. The new millennium is coming, and the old bets about human nature were off. I would guess if George were here today and that book were going to be reprinted, he would write it with a very different introduction. And it would be more about the songs of experience mapped onto the songs of innocence. And that is still it's another thing I've learned is that there's a permanent duality, that we have continuous phases in our lives of new openings, new beginning, novelty. What the Latin phrase puer, P-U-E-R, refers to the young, the youth. We have in our lives recurring phases of puer consciousness. Everything is new again. Novelty is possible, creativity. But there's also phases of what Jung called the senex, S-E-N-E-X, sen as in the same term for senility or concretized consciousness. So there's a dance between the young, the puer, and the senex and the old. And so now that I am older in years, I have greater appreciation for the shortcomings of utopian thinking and expectations that transformation is imminent and permanent, because human nature is very complicated. There is something about our nature that is emergent. I'm strongly in the evolutionary camp that our nature is not completely expressed, and yet it is an exploratory process, and there will be more blind alleys. There will be more teachers who come with insights, who will also turn out to have clay feet. Esalen is a perfect shrine for those teachers. I'm in favor of, I don't want to put up statues of early teachers around Esalen, but if they were to be there was a statue of Fritz Perls. There'd be people who come and spend time with and acknowledge what he was brilliant at and what he was insane about. It's probably true with just about every aspect of everything Esalen has touched.
Keith Thompson, you are the author of the UFO Paradox. It's available at all major booksellers. It's available on Audible, read by the author, I might add. I listened to it myself. Thank you so much for joining us today on Voices of Esalen. It's been great to hear your reflections on Esalen.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been great to go down this road again. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Shira Levine. Our theme was composed by Nico Holloman. Additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. I'll be answering listener questions in some subsequent episodes, so if you have a question or a comment, please email me, sam.stern@esalen.org. Until next time, be well.